So we're going to read the first 10 verses of chapter 1 and kind of get into Daniel, talk about Joseph and who he was just a little bit, and we'll go on from there. So this is the Bible. This is chapter 37 of Genesis, and it's the first 10 verses. Now Jacob dwelt in the land where his father was a stranger in the land of Canaan. And this is the story of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brothers, and the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wife, and Joseph brought a bad report to them of them to his father. Now Israel loved Joseph, and Jacob and Israel are the same person. Israel loved Joseph more than all his children because he was the son of his old age. Also he made a tunic of many colors, but when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. I want to just stop there for a minute because there's a history with this. You remember the story of Jacob? Jacob wanted to marry Rachel, and he worked for 7 years to marry Rachel, and then Rachel's dad tricked him and gave him Leah, and so he married Leah. Then he had to work 7 more years to get Rachel, and there's the whole story of this, how Jacob married, and the whole story is kind of a crazy story in the Bible. But Leah gave Joseph lots of sons, and Rachel couldn't conceive sons. And he ended up actually marrying 2 of his servants and having more sons from them. And finally, Rachel gave him Joseph in his old age. Now there's 2 reasons why Jacob favored Joseph. Jacob favored Joseph because he was a child of his old age. And I understand this because my brother Bob and I are the last 2 of 7 kids. My dad had 5 kids, and they waited 10 years and had me and my brother. And Bob and I were not raised the same way our older siblings were raised. There were stricter rules. There was a different, I understand from having our own kids that when you have your first child, you're so protective, and you have rules, and you do things a certain way. And by the time you have more kids, with the first child, every time you drop the pacifier, you bring it up, you boil it, and you make sure it's nice and clean, and you give it back to them. By the time you've had your last child, you spit on it, wipe it on your shirt, and give it back to them, and don't worry about it. The rules change. The way you raise your kids change. And so by the time Joseph comes along, Jacob isn't the same guy he was when his first son was born. And Joseph, Bob and I have compared it to at times that we were almost raised more like grandchildren than as children, with looser rules and looser ideas. And Joseph is more raised like a grandchild than a child because of the way he came along and because he was Rachel's son. And Jacob loved Rachel. He accepted Leah. Leah was his wife, and he learned to love Leah. But his love, his passion, was for Rachel, and Joseph was Rachel's son. And so, unfortunately, there was favoritism, and there shouldn't be favoritism, but we also have to remember Jacob was a product of favoritism. His mother favored him, and he got his older brother's birthright through trickery and favoritism. And so this is kind of a family thing. And favoritism isn't good. Whenever you have favoritism in a family, there's going to be problems. And I think that's one of the great things about the Bible is that God doesn't polish the stories. He doesn't just choose the people that are all the best people, that don't have problems and don't have crud in the family and stuff that they have to deal with, because we have crud in our lives and we have problems in our families, and there are times that things don't go all the ways we wish they would. And so we can look at a situation where there's kind of a home with problems, and God still uses that home, and God still uses those people. Anyway, I wanted to just kind of stop there, picking up verse 5. Now Joseph had a dream, and he told it to his brothers, and they hated him even more. He said to them, please hear this dream which I have dreamed. We were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and also stood upright. And indeed, your sheaves stood all around and bowed down to my sheaf. And his brother said to him, shall you indeed reign over us? Or shall you indeed have dominion over us? so they hated him even more for his dream and for his words. And he dreamed still another dream, and told his brothers and said, "Look, I have dreamed another dream, and this time the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars all bowed down to me." So he told it to his father and his brothers, and the father rebuked him and said to him, "What is this dream you have dreamed? Shall your mother and I, and even your brothers indeed, come down and bow to the earth before you?" And his brothers envied him, but his father kept this matter in his mind. And I just think about in this story, it's a young man who lacks wisdom, really. I mean, how did he expect his brothers to react? "Hey guys, guess what? I had a dream, and in my dream you guys are all going to bow down to me." And his brothers already don't like him because he's got the colored coat. He's the favored one. Oh, he's the one everybody wants to treat better, and Dad loves him more, and all this stuff. So he's already got conflict, and then he comes along with these dreams. And I just think that if he'd been a more seasoned, maybe a little bit older, and understood his giftings better, he'd say, "Well, that was an interesting dream. I don't think I'm going to tell that to my brothers right now."
Yes, amen.
You know, I think I'll just keep that to myself. But then there's another side to it, because if he didn't tell his brothers, they would never have sold him into slavery, and none of the good things that happened would ever have happened to him. And so it's kind of well, what are you doing? But God knows who he's giving his gift to, and God knows what Joseph's going to do with the gift, and God knows that he has to be unwise in the using of his gift and tell his brothers, so he gets sold into slavery, so he can go save his family ultimately in the end of the story. And so it's a roundabout thing that you know, we wouldn't do what he would do, and that's why he called Joseph instead of calling someone else. Instead of calling somebody with more wisdom that would just keep his mouth shut, or instead of telling someone who was more wise with how he would use his gift, he needed a young guy that would talk before thinking and kind of maybe be a little proud of himself and be the favored one, because God had a plan. And even Don and I were talking a little bit last night about the people that God calls, you know, and how many of the people in the Bible do we look at and say, "I would never have called that person"? You know, people who you know, David, who God calls a man after his own heart, just makes mistake after mistake after mistake after mistake. But then he goes to God and he says, "I'm sorry. I do love you. I want to be like you. I want to have your heart. I want to be like you." And he pursues God, but he's flawed. We read the story of Samson, who was one of the great judges. And Samson kept on chasing women and making mistakes, and God kept on giving Samson his strength back. He gave him his gifts. And when you think about the New Testament and all the disciples that Jesus called, we talked about this a little bit last week. He calls these sailors and calls these rough guys to be his disciples, and we wouldn't have called any of them. In fact, the only person that Jesus called that we might think was qualified was Judas, because he came out of the temple and he had education in how to serve, and he was the one that failed. And so God understands us. He understands He understands that we're flawed. Every one of us have our flaws. Man, I made so many mistakes when I was young. I would have disqualified myself from being a pastor. I would never have called myself. In fact, years and years ago when I was in high school, we had a minister come and tell, he prophesied over me and told me that I was going to be a minister. And my thought was, boy, did you blow it this time. You don't even know what you're talking about. I don't want to be a pastor. I'm not qualified to be a pastor. You don't know who I am. You don't know my mistakes. You've really missed it this time. That was my thought. But God, thankfully, understands his callings and his giftings, and he calls and he gifts us in the midst of who we are, in the midst of our failure. And he trusts us to mature. And, well, why did God give this person a gift and not give this person a gift? Why did God call this person and not call this person? God has the capacity to see our potential, to see who we really are. He knows us better than we know ourselves. We see when he calls Gideon, his first words to Gideon he calls him mighty man of valor. And I've preached on Gideon so many times. Gideon was not a man of valor. Valor is what you did. If you are a man of valor, then you've accomplished stuff. And Gideon didn't accomplish anything. Gideon, when he gets this word saying, you're a mighty man of valor, he's hiding behind he's on the threshing floor, threshing out his wheat, hiding. He's not a man of bravery. He's not a man of courage. He's not a leader of armies. But God speaks to him and says, you're a mighty man of valor. Why? Because God knows Gideon's potential. When Jesus is talking to his disciples and the disciples are standing around and he's having this kind of a face-to-face with them, well, who's everybody saying I am? What are they saying about me? And different ones are saying, well, some of them say you're Moses, and some of them say you're Elijah, and different things. And he says, well, who do you guys say I am? And Matthew speaks up and he says, you're the Christ, you're the Son of the living God. And Jesus looks at Matthew, and Matthew is this guy who talks without thinking. And he doesn't have follow through. He says, I'll back you up no matter what. If the armies rise up against you, I'll die protecting you and all this stuff. And then he denies Jesus 3 times. Matthew is...
Peter.
How am I saying? Peter. I'm sorry. Peter. I know in my mind I'm seeing the right person, but I'm saying the wrong name. Peter is the one that always just is like, talk before you think and say what you're going to say, but it's never really who you are. And it's not until Jesus dies on the cross and he comes back and he has this conversation about feeding his sheep with Peter that Jesus, really what he's revealing to Peter is, I know who you are. I understand your failures. Because what Jesus is saying, Peter, he says, you're a rock, I'm going to build my church on you. And Peter's not a rock. Peter's wishy-washy. He's a flip-flopper. And when Jesus comes to Peter in this scene by way they have the breakfast, and he says, Peter, do you love me almost like God? Do you love me as someone you trust and who you would serve? And Peter has been emptied. And he says, Jesus, I love you like a friend. And Jesus says, feed my sheep. And he says, Peter, do you love me like someone you can come to and trust and serve? And Peter says, no, I just love you like a friend. And then Jesus says, Peter, do you just love me like a friend? And Peter says, you know everything. I'm not going to brag anymore. I'm not going to act like I'm going to do one thing and then do something else. This is who I am. I understand my weakness. I understand my failures. And all I can do is love you like a friend right now. And what Jesus says to him is, you're still qualified. Feed my sheep. I've always known this is who you are. You never had to be this thing you were painting yourself to be. All you had to be was you. And I'll make you who you need to be. And so often we're called by God into things, and we look at our own lives and we say, God, I'm not qualified. I'm not old enough. I'm too old. I'm not educated enough. I'm too educated in the wrong way. Or we just have all of the things that we know about ourselves that we think disqualify us to serve God. God, you don't know all the sin I have had in my life. And God says, I know everything. And we disqualify ourselves, but Jesus, with that sacrifice that he made on Calvary, with the work he did on the cross, he qualified us. And he said, I know who you are. Joseph, I know you're young. I know you're going to talk without thinking. I know you're going to say things to your brothers that you shouldn't say because they're going to listen to what you say and get mad at you, and you got a whole bunch of bad stuff going to happen. But I've got this, and you're still the right man for the job. And so I think that first part of this message for you guys is God's qualified you. Every one of you, you're qualified to serve God in some way. Every one of you have gifts that God can use. And you have to stop saying, but God, you don't know. Because God knows. God's aware of your shortcomings. God's aware of your mistakes. And he says, I've still qualified you. So Joseph's dreams, he has these crazy dreams of his brothers serving in, the sheaves bowing down and the stars bowing down. And God's got a plan for that. And God knows what's going to happen. God shows Joseph what's going to happen, but he doesn't show him how he's going to get there. He doesn't show him all the things that have to happen before his brothers bow down to him. He doesn't show him all the things that have to happen for this dream to become a reality. And I think that we have to understand that when God gifts us, that we don't always get the whole picture of what he's doing in our lives even. I've had some success in interpreting dreams. God showed me some interpretations for people's dreams. I've had dreams. It's something that God's just done. And I didn't ask for it. And there's times I'll get someone telling me a dream and I'm like, I don't know. But there's times they'll tell me the dreams and it's just like it crystallizes and I know this is what God's saying to you. But I don't know how they're going to get there. I know maybe that God's saying that there's something in your life that he's working on or something in his life that's going to happen. But I have no context for how those things are realized. And God's gifts aren't always just, oh wow, I got the whole picture. God has the whole picture and we get pieces of a puzzle. I mean, can you imagine someone just gives you like a third of the pieces to a puzzle and doesn't give you the picture of what it is you're making? I mean, how do you even begin putting them together, right? All the pieces you have may not even go together. And that's what God's prophetic word a lot of the time is, or that's what the visions that God gives to people sometimes are, or that's the dreams that God gives people. They get a part, they get maybe their part or a part for somebody or something that they know, well, that's God's voice and God's speaking. I mean, God told me when I was 16 years old I was going to be a pastor, and I was 37 years before I stepped behind a pulpit, with a lot of resistance in between. And so we have to understand that when God gifts us, the gifts matter and what God does through us matters, but we don't have to understand everything that's part of that gift. All we have to do is be faithful to use the gift that God gives us and to use the gift that God gives us. And we don't have to have all the pieces. And we don't know what we don't need to know what the whole puzzle is going to look like in the end, because God's going to work that stuff out. And so that's the other thing that I think that God is saying in this story of this young man who doesn't know how to use his gifts and is going to grow in his gifts, that God has a purpose for us and he has a plan for us, and each one of us is like one of those puzzle pieces that fits into the whole picture. And sometimes we don't know where we fit in. Sometimes we don't know what the puzzle is going to look like when we fit into place, or even what our gifts are. There's some people that are still figuring out, well, they'll ask, do I even have a gift? Well, the answer is, yeah, you have a gift. I believe every one of us has a gift that we can use to serve God. But you got to figure out what the gift is. And maybe you get a little bit of it's like the Bible talks about looking in a glass darkly, like you have a mirror that is dirty and you can't completely clean it. Have you ever seen one of these antique mirrors that have been sitting in the sun for so long that part of the reflective part is gone? And so when you look in it, you see pieces of yourself, but a lot of stuff is missing. That's how it is sometimes. We're looking in this mirror saying, I see a lot, but I don't see the whole thing. I don't really understand how God's going to use me. I don't really understand what I can do for God. I want to serve him. but I don't know how to serve him. I don't know what my gifts all are. Or you begin to understand, wow, I have a gift of serving, or I have a gift of speaking, or I have a gift of prophecy, or I have a gift of healing. Okay, so what do I even do with that? How do I begin to use those gifts? And how do I begin to operate in those gifts? It's all a process. And because we're all individuals, and because we all come from different families and different parts of the country and different ideas and ways of thinking, you can have two people that both have a gift of healing, and they operate in those gifts completely differently. Or you can have two people that have a prophetic gift, and when they prophesy, their prophecies are right, and they're doing what God called them to do, but they sound completely differently when they prophesy. And then you see some people that are using gifts, and you're like, how could God even call that person? Because we know too much about him. And God says, don't worry, I got this. I know what I'm doing. And so that's kind of my introduction to Joseph. I feel like he's a man who is going to grow, and we're going to watch him grow. A lot of the things we have to remember for Joseph is we see things happen in his life, and God doesn't give a time frame. You know, we don't know, for example, how long he works for Potiphar before he goes to jail. We don't know necessarily how long he's in jail before he starts serving the king. So different things that are going to happen along the way, we don't always get a full understanding of how old he is or how much time goes by until certain parts of the story. But think about how, because it kind of sounds like it's immediate. He did this, and he did this, and he did this, and he did this, and it's not the case. And so we're going to have some fun. We're going to look at Joseph and the things that happened to him, the ups and downs, and kind of see some of the failures in the family along the way, and we'll talk about that, because I feel like there's like shortcomings of certain individuals in almost every part of the story, and we see how God can take shortcomings and do something with it. So it's going to be fun. All right, everybody stand. Father, we thank you for your word, and we thank you for the stories that you've left for us in your word, the characters that we can look to and see flaws in, and they're flawed and we're flawed. We all have our areas of brokenness, and we all have our areas of failure that we have to work through. And we're so thankful that you show us people in your word that you used in a mighty way who didn't have it all together. Because it gives us hope. It gives us hope that you can use us when we have failed. When we would disqualify ourselves, and you're the one qualifying us because you love us so much. Thank you that we can be your children to serve you. Thank you that we can love you and you love us. And it's through your love that you gift us, and it's through your love that you call us. That we each have a part to play. That we each have an area where we can serve. That we each have a place in your kingdom, that without that piece, the puzzle would never be complete. But you've called us, and you've gifted us. And it's just amazing what you do through us, Lord. We sometimes feel so inadequate. But Lord, you make up the difference, and you're good. And we praise you for that in Jesus' name. Amen and amen. All right, well, we're going to get ready to have a little meeting in the back. I'm sure Elena's on the